dedicated over 3 years of service as volunteer co-president of NCJW. Freya earns a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing from Vanderbilt University and a Bachelor of Arts degree from Dartmouth College in environmental studies. Please join me in welcoming Freya Sachs.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Bess. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. I want to introduce Bess briefly. Bess Kalb is an Emmy-nominated comedy writer and best-selling author of Nobody Will Tell You This But Me, a New York Times editor's choice. She wrote for 8 years on Jimmy Kimmel Live and has written for the Emmy Awards, the Academy Awards, and the 2020 Democratic National Convention. She is the head writer and executive producer of the WGA Award-nominated Yearly Departed, an Amazon comedy special, and is currently adapting Nobody Will Tell You This But Me into a feature film with sight unseen pictures. So thank you for being here. I have some questions to get us going. If anyone who is listening would like to put them in the Q&A box, I will weave them into our conversation. Would you mind starting by just talking a little bit how the book came to be? I read this right around when it came out and loved the book, The Voice, the Jewish grandmother. And would love for you to talk a little bit about how the book came to be, why you decided to write it in Bobby's voice.
Sure. Thank you for reading it and for reading it around the time when it came out. That was a time when I was extremely nervous to promote it. It came out on March 17th of 2020, which is right as the world went into lockdown. And it was a time of great fear and anxiety and uncertainty and ironically, an ideal time for people to be comforted by this book, as difficult and like odious as it was for me to be like, hey, here's a link to your local bookseller. Like, I know this is not your concern. We're out of toilet paper. But one thing that's so lovely to hear from people who read it right at the beginning was like, oh, right at the beginning of the pandemic, you had my grandma Bobby in your head. And so that makes me very happy because it's a time when I really needed her. And so I'm glad that you had her too. How this came to be was really a very private thing. I don't know for those of you who are joining us, I don't know how many of you have read the book, but the idea that I would be speaking to 53 people about my grandmother was unfathomable to me. I'm somebody who hid behind other people's voices for my entire career. I was a fact checker at a magazine and would always sort of adapt to the voice of the predominantly male-dominated magazine where I worked. Then, of course, when I wrote for Jimmy, I was only writing jokes in his voice, and it was just like, if a famous white man was saying it, like, then it's okay to be funny. And so the idea that I would write a book like this was not in my comfort zone. And I think writing in my grandmother's voice was for me a very natural thing. And it happened because I was tasked with delivering her eulogy at her funeral. And I woke my husband up at 2 a.m. the morning of her funeral and said, like, okay, I've done 8 drafts. They're all super trite and sort of like couched in cliches and, beloved grandmother, loved us fiercely. And there's nothing wrong with saying any of that. I just really didn't feel like I was doing her any justice. And so I woke Charlie up and I said, what if I just did it as her? Would that be in poor taste? And he was like, yeah, potentially. Like, what? And I was like, just trust me, I've got this. So I got up there and I said a eulogy that's in this book right now that I'm holding. I said a voicemail that was in this book. And I got up there and I said, I'm going to say this as grandma because she should have the last word and I shouldn't. And I talked about, in this voicemail, I talked about how she would fly up from Florida to take care of me when I was a baby. And in the middle of it, I said, I have to go. That's my call waiting. And then I said, okay, I'm back, and began mid-sentence. And I looked out into this audience of my grieving family, of my grief-stricken grandfather, especially. And he was laughing and sort of looking around with recognition and remembrance. And so once I sort of won over that extremely tough crowd by doing this character, by writing in her voice and speaking as her, I knew I had something. And that's how the book began. It began on I almost said on stage, but it began in the synagogue at the podium at her funeral.
Yeah. And what were some of sort of the challenges and the joys of writing through her voice? I think it's especially interesting to think about that in light of you saying that you're so used to channeling other people's voices.
Yes, and you know what? Challenges and joys is exactly that. That is what it was. That is the experience. It either was a challenge or it was a joy, and like there was no in between. And the challenge wasn't in the writing itself. It was just in the remembering and the feeling her. I was writing this as somebody in the throes of grief, and as much as it helped me cope, and as much joy as it brought me, and reliving great memories, and feeling her wit and her warmth and her voice. There were also times where I had to confront darker aspects of her life, especially in the relationship with her only daughter, my mother. And so the challenge of writing through grief was immense. My husband would walk into the room where I wrote, and I was either laughing or crying. There was no in between. And so it was sort of like, he was like, "Oh God, this is why you don't marry a Jewish woman." And also like, I get it. This book is a very pendular experience to write. I think the most challenging part was after I had this first pass of a manuscript, my editor, very brilliant woman named Robin Desser. Everybody involved in the behind the scenes of this book, by the way, was a woman. And everybody involved in what will happen next to the book is a woman. So that's just something. Something that was felt important to the story and to our relationship and to the book. But she said, "Okay, I need you to include the darker parts. I understand this is a love letter to your grandmother, but I need you to become critical of her." And so in the second pass of my book, the most challenging parts of the book, when I was actually in the first trimester of my pregnancy, I wrote about her childhood, and I did a deep dive into Russian history to write about her mother, to sort of contextualize how painful it was for her growing up in a household without affection. And that was really challenging, but it ultimately, I think, created a better picture of her and a more whole picture of her as a flawed woman, and I'm glad I went there.
Yeah, I love that image of sort of the nesting dolls, of the Russian dolls layers of the story.
Totally. Yeah, it's pretty apt.
Yeah. One of the things that I find so compelling thinking about this book is sort of the way that, as you're saying, it's written from a place of love, whereas so many memoirs, and then I have other questions about sort of genre in relation to the book, but so many memoirs are written out of a place of anger or frustration, or really sort of disconnect from family or situation that's being thought about. Curious if you could talk a little bit about that and sort of how your book relates to kind of other books in the genre, and how it's really, I think, doing something different.
That's a great question. And it's one that I, haven't really thought a lot about, because I didn't see it as a memoir. I saw it as more like the closest I could get to reportage. Like this is like me reporting her life. And I think because I have that distance of that, like Russian, I have the distance of, this is not my memoir. This is her biography, but told in her voice through me. It was sort of hard to classify, but I draw from some of my favorite books are memoirs. And I think I'm probably a more voracious nonfiction reader than I am a fiction reader. And so I sort of grew up forged in the crucible of David Sedaris, and I guess people who wrote about their family and people who wrote about their family in grief, like Joan Didion, sort of taught me that there is a way to write about family with love and profoundly sorrowful recollection, and also with a lot of humor. And so, there are definitely the sort of like slash and burn memoirs that are juicy and fun to read, but I gravitate toward stories about love and stories that have heart and wit to them. And I've learned from the masters of that craft just by reading them nonstop. And so I hope that this book exists on the shelf with people who are like, affectionate stories about people who I have like a gimlet eye toward, and not so much in the like juicy, let me tell you about my trauma, because I will say, for those of you who have read it, this book does deal with a very fraught relationship between a mother and a daughter, and one that could, depending on your read of the DSM, qualify as psychological or emotional abuse in some ways. My mother was the daughter of an absent mother, and that person happens to be my beloved grandmother. And so it's complicated, but I found I just had to be truthful to the best of to serve the facts as best as I could. And life isn't just a sort of rosy memoir, and it isn't an angry screed. It sort of exists somewhere between the two for me. And so I hope to represent that with this book.
Yeah, and I think you have. I mean, I think it's a lovely kind of mix of those things. A couple of things come to my mind. One is, how do you sort of reconcile your truth and experience in relationship in a way that doesn't take away other people's stories or truth of their experiences and relationships in that sort of channeling of voice and telling
It's the hardest part. I mean, this is a lot of chutzpah to do, to say, like, I will write my grandmother's life story in her voice, but it's me doing it. And the author's note, I think, is probably the most important part of the book, which is, this is not an objective account of her life. It basically, it's author's note, but it should say disclaimer. And in many ways, that was sort of preempt the idea that I was the authority on her, or that this is her definitive life story. This really isn't. We have to remember as people who interact with this book, even me, the writer, that nobody will tell you this but me. The me is me. It's not my grandmother. I am the one who wrote it, even though it's in her words and in her voice. So this like ventriloquist act is one that could be really disrespectful if done improperly or done authoritatively. And I'm really trying to do neither. And I even question the authorship in this book in the second half after me. It's very clear that I'm writing in this almost supernatural way from beyond the grave, that this isn't somebody with a tape recorder. This is somebody doing a channeling. And so, my cousins, my grandmother's other grandchildren could each write a book like this. She loved each of us equally and fiercely. That she spent the most time with me is really just the reason that, the idea of my pet came into being. She called me her angel and her pet. She raised me because my mom had to go back to work when I was an infant. And so I think proximity, it's not like I was a particularly special grandchild. We were just close together in space and time. And so that's why I wrote this. It's why I was the one who delivered the eulogy. But there's everybody who interacted with my grandmother loved her. And, her friends could write a book that would bring you to tears. Certainly her children, her husband, her grandchildren. It's not just me. But this book happens. This is my best shot at it.
Yeah. And how did that sort of in-betweenness, the sort of as told to me, not quite nonfiction memoir, some of the sort of flexibility you get in writing fiction, but without taking too many liberties, how do you think that sort of influenced your choices and sort of the moves throughout the book?
I tried to not be bound by genre when I was writing this. If I had it, it would be a very different book. I just sort of tried to be true to my grandma, and that was the genre. The genre is like Bobby Bell, postmodern dialogue, voicemail fiction with pictures. Because I was really just trying to tell her story the way she would tell it. And the way she told her story was on voicemails. And in conversations where she was just sliding it in at the end when it was about something else, and where I was a part of it, and where other people were interjecting, and there were certainly long passages and long sort of prose-like screeds, but really she was somebody who existed as voicemails and telephone calls and discussions over lunch, and so I tried not to do a typical genre book. I tried to just represent our relationship the way it existed. And so, it came out the way that it did, with tons of pictures and images and menus, and because that's how she lived. And I have to credit a true as told to me story. That's from brilliant assistant at Knopf, Annie Bashai, who's so smart, and whose eye and careful read of this was so transformative to drafts of it. And I really took all of her advice to heart. I just think she's so smart. And a true as told to me story was all her, because nobody at this like big fancy publishing house could figure out what to call this. It's either a novel or a memoir. And it was sort of like, well, this Bess Kalb book is ruining our search engine optimization. So Annie figured it out.
I think that's so of the moment we're in, where sort of genres are breaking apart in so many
Totally.
It's
Yes.
interesting to think about how you categorize something that is full of truth, even if it's not the truth that others might expect or told in a way that people expect it to be.
That's much better put than yes. What I said. Yes, that's what it is.
I love that you have this record of her voicemails, and it's kind of an amazing and wonderful thing. And I keep thinking about what archives look like now, right? Like, we don't have the sort of collection of, you know, this person's letters to go search through, or whether it's family or famous writer or famous human, whoever it may be. And so much in our world is sort of the ephemeral Snapchat story or Instagram live or text message that disappears. Would you talk a little bit about the voicemails, how you happen to have them, how you use them, how you would gather information in the future, that sort of memory making, memory keeping piece?
I think that that really is it. That sort of like our artifacts are so ephemeral now. And I think you probably have such a front row seat to this as an educator. You're seeing an entire generation who's like, look, this is how I was asked to prom, and it's something that disappears in 10 seconds, or I don't have a Snapchat, so I don't 100% know how or why it works. But yeah, I'm sure you really see this. What is it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand Snapchat either, but I do see it, and sort of the relationship with text is changing, and memory and how we hold on to things.
Yes, and how we hold on to it is all on these little screens, and I have them right here. This is one thing that it's kind of cool to do for fans of grandma voicemail screenshots. You'll be really excited if those of you like. It's a very niche thing this is my party trick. Sadly, but I wouldn't be able to do this if it were a book event with an audience, but since we're all right next to our screens, I can show you, if you've read the book, that I'm still an insane person who has not deleted a single voicemail, and they're all here on my screen at my grandma's various house or apartment locations, whether she was in Florida or New York or Massachusetts. She is still here on my phone. And then the other voicemails that I've saved are one from the director of the movie about her life, right above it, Elizabeth Chomko. One from my other grandma, who I was like, I have to make room, and she's wonderful. She's still alive. And one from my doctor accidentally telling us it's a boy. Not that we weren't like gender reveal people at all. But she was just like, and we got the prenatal results back, and he's looking good genetically, and I can't wait to tell you the gender if you want to know that. And we were like, Dr. V.
It just did.
The pronoun snuck in. But so those are the voicemails that I have, and my grandma is 99.9% of them. And the reason for that, and the reason I started saving them and archiving them, and I can't physically delete them. There's something really barbaric about being like, delete. I've been assured that they exist on the cloud. This is not the phone that I've had this whole time. This is a phone that I recently got after my old one refused to. It was so old it wouldn't even update. But I can't delete them, and it's all I have of her, and I don't even listen to them. I just have them. There's this. I've said this, but I think it bears there. I didn't transcribe voicemails to write this book. So when I say there are her voicemails in this book, they're my renditions of things that she has said to me on hundreds of voicemails, the stories that she would tell me when I wasn't able to interject because she was just talking to my voicemail machine. So they weren't transcripts. And then I recorded the audiobook to Nobody Will Tell You This But Me. And a very savvy woman said, well, we should include some of the voicemails for audio bonus features. And I was like, oh, totally. That makes so much sense. It's an audio thing. Like, yes, why not? She was like, great. So just send those over, the ones that you like, and we'll do it. I was like, great. And she was like, hey, it's been like a month and a half, and you said you were sending them. So, and I was like, oh, yeah, totally on it. I like blamed the baby, whatever. And we'll do it. And I looked at Charlie and I was just like, I haven't listened to them. I can't do it. I can't listen to it. And he was like, you have to do it. Contractually, you have to do it. And I was like, that makes sense. And so I was very dramatic about it. I had him take the baby into the kitchen, and I sat in our bedroom on the what is it? reclining chair, the rocking, the glider, I don't know, the thing that we got from my cousin. And I sat there and I drew the blackout curtains and I had my phone out and I prepared to listen to my grandmother's voicemails. All I really have left of her, because she is her stories and her voice. I have her things, but this is her voice. And I pressed play, and 5 minutes later, my husband ran in with our infant son, and I was wailing. He heard me like animalistic cries, and he walked in. He's like, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And I was laughing. I was laughing hysterically because they were so much funnier, unfortunately, than anything in the book. I was floored by these one after another. It was just like the hits kept coming. One of them was, "You can't write this or make this up. I'm a comedy writer. I will never adopt this." She goes, "Bessie, it's grandma. Your mother says you have laryngitis. Call me back." And it's just like, what? Yeah, that's why I screened your call. I can't talk. So it's just like, she had one that she was like going on and on about. She heard that I got patio furniture from IKEA, and she was certain that like if I had people over, it would collapse and it would be a lawsuit. And it's just like, okay, grandma, that's where I have a lot of my furniture from. Like, it's okay. And then, so yeah, they were great.
That is wonderful. Does it make you want to save all the things that shouldn't be saved?
Totally. What a lesson. It's like, everyone said that I was crazy for when they call me. It's like the mailbox belonging to this person is full, unless it's like, I basically have room for like 5 voicemails. But yeah, it does make me want to, it makes me realize that sometimes what we discard or what we take for granted or what just seems like an everyday part of life could be a treasure. Which is exactly what a hoarder would say, I realize, as I say it out loud.
Writer, hoarder,
Yeah, but this is a digital thing, and
Yeah. I have a couple more things I am curious about, and just want to remind folks, if there are questions you want to make sure we get to put them in the Q&A feature. One thing that really struck me was sort of the way you've talked about this as sort of being a manual to get through your grief, which you mentioned earlier as well. And I think it is fascinating to think about that. The book coming out right at the beginning of a year that has been so full of grief for so many on sort of personal, local, global, national scales, as we think both about COVID-19 pandemic, but also the other pandemic of sort of increased incidences of racism and police brutality.
Yes.
Even in the last 48 hours that we're watching unfold again.
Yes.
I am curious, sort of that mantra of the book, like the world is cracking under all of our feet. I would be curious how sort of writing and sharing this book through the last year has helped you, if it has, make sense of what's happening around us.
That's so beautifully contextualized, and it really is the sort of mantra of the year for me. And I'm so glad that it's been like a little bit of wisdom for so many people as we're all trying to find tools to cope with just like the unending trauma that happens around us every day, and the feeling of helplessness and hopelessness that happens when terrible things are happening to other people. And whether or not this year has affected, God forbid, your immediate family or somebody that you love or someone that just seeing the toll on the news every day has been really horrific. And my grandma was a master of getting through the horrific. And she came from a woman who actually survived in unimaginable trauma. A big part of this book and a passage that I think about a lot during this year when I think about struggle and hardship, and when I'm sort of looking for a place of empathy for others going through unimaginable horror. My great-grandmother Rose came to America alone at age 13 from the Pale of Settlement to flee the pogroms in the 1880s. And she fled alone on foot as a child and got to America. And the sentiment of when the earth is cracking behind you, you put one foot in front of the other and you keep going, comes from that generation. It came from my grandmother Zader, her grandfather, who made a similar journey. It's not one that's in the matrilineal lore of this book, but it's from somebody who, like so many of us, like all Jews in America, are the product of immigrants, and products of people who, in many cases, fled religious persecution. And I think about it all the time. It's a brilliant phrase. It's one that comes from grit and determination and fortitude, but also just a fair amount of Jewish of chutzpah. It's a word I've now used twice, but it is. It's when you feel like the whole world is going to swallow you up, you keep going. And I've said it to myself. I'm so glad that there have been other people who have used it as a way to get them through a tough time. And I know it would make my grandma really happy because she said it all the time, and she said it so that I'd remember it. So many of her stories are stories that I didn't even need to research. I didn't need to ask my mom a question or my grandpa. They are stories and sayings that she just hammered into me, and so that they can be part of so many readers' lives and our outlook. I think would make her feel at least like finally someone was listening.
Yeah. We've got some questions coming in about sort of family reactions. How did your mother react to the book? How has sort of it been received by your family in the sense of it sort of being your truth?
Yes, I live in a cabin in the woods now. I know. Can you imagine if it was like terrible? My mom is always my toughest and most important audience for anything, like so many of us. And she's also a really brilliant writer and editor. In her spare time. And, when I was a kid, my mom is a doctor, but she wrote a book on just our home IBM computer. And I discovered it when I was 11 years old and decided I'll never write because I'll never be as good as this. And I still think about it and how sometimes I'm kind of copying her style. But she's a really brilliant writer. And I sent her the manuscript before I sent it to my editor. She avoided it, and it was hard to avoid that because we all were in the same house that summer, and just would talk about anything else. And she avoided it, and eventually she was legally required to read it because when the publishing house did their legal read, they were like, well, we flagged 100 parts and they're all for your mom. And so I was like, Mom, I will be sued if you don't, or the concern is that you will sue me if you don't read it now. And she read it, and she read it in 2 stages. The first was she read the first page and she put it down and she said, I can't, it's grandma. It is her voice. And I was like, well, as an author, that's extremely gratifying because this is an act of channeling and trying to capture an authentic voice, and I did that. On the other hand, that's the most devastating thing I could hear because you need to get through it. Sorry you had a daughter who decided that this would be her literary pursuit. It would be to torture you. And so here we are. And she finally did read it, and she was thrilled. And I knew she would be because she was the primary source for this book. My mom was on the phone with me as I was writing this at 11 at night when I was like, is it Georgie or Leo who sat for the exams? Tell me the story of the Chicago 7 and the Mexico phone call, and tell me about what it was like going to colleges with her. What was it like? My mom walked into the room in her apartment where I was writing it for a hiatus from work, and told me the story that's called Pink Milk in this book. If you've read it, she told it to me like it was a police blotter. I was like, for the second draft, I was like, I need some more bad stories about grandma. She was like, okay, well, and just sort of spelled it out as I frantically typed, to get it down. She said it she was like, I was 10, I had headaches, I was prescribed phenobarbital, I started sleepwalking, I was found in a ditch and almost died, and then she took me back to get a prescription renewal, and the doctor was naked. And I was like, it's going in the book. So these stories are stories that on the one, it's going in the book is, I realize, an incredibly callous reaction to your mother telling you that she almost died. But I was like, we're good here. But which is to say, she supplied me with these stories. She also gave me stories that I did not include in the book. To protect her, stories where she didn't come off well. And so I was already editing because she is somebody who is very much alive and has friends who could read this. So I'd protect, she even was like, I'm not even going to tell you what the story was about, but she was like, why isn't the blank story in there? And I was like, Mom. And so she was happy with it, even though it was difficult for her to read for all of those reasons.
Yeah. So wondering if you'll talk a little bit about sort of the Jewishness of this book.
Yes.
Right? One person commented, Kara did, that she loved this book. It's also so Jewish.
Yes.
She's curious to hear how it's been received by non-Jewish readers and if you feel like there are any cross-cultural misreadings or misunderstandings. I know one of the first conversations I had about this book was with a friend who isn't Jewish. And she said, I love this and this and this. And then I read it and said, right. And there's like all these other things that I keep thinking about too. And it was such an interesting moment, even in that conversation, of the different ways of reading.
I'm curious, what were the things that made sense, or do you do? It was a long time ago.
I was think that she was thinking so much about sort of the grandmother voice and the closeness with her grandmother and those elements. And then I found myself thinking, right, but I like hear every Jewish grandmother I have ever talked to in this extra way. Yeah. And sort of those layers of, I think, the cultural component of it and the history of the pogroms and immigration and kind of what it has meant to come to this country for the last, of course, Holocaust and after, but also for so many of us before that.
Yes. Yeah, I totally hear that. It's been my second reader after the email to my mom is my writing partner and dearest friend, who is a guy who grew up fundamentalist. I'm not sure what the correct word for it, but the type of religious Christianity where Harry Potter was forbidden and The Simpsons was forbidden. And he was absolutely evangelical, but it was in a small rural Northern California town where he grew up, and his parents were much older when they had him, and he never met his grandparents. So this is somebody who had never met a Jew before he got to, and then he went to a super evangelical college. He never met a Jew before he moved to Los Angeles and defected and became a comedy writer. But he had no affiliation with a grandmother. So this is like the worst possible test audience. And he's also the person who I trust most in this world as a friend and a writer. He's also like, we have none of the same, he's like a super nerd, like really into Marvel. And now he was writing the next Ant-Man. So good for Jeff. But Jeff was the person that I trust, and sent this to him, and he was like, yes. This is beautiful, and I don't have anyone to think about who this reminds me of, but I get it. And I think about books that have really moved me, and I'm such a foreigner to them. The book that made me weep the most recently was a book called Pachinko that took place in Korea and Japan, and I have never been to either of those places. And I didn't even know, I shamefully had very little understanding of Japanese occupation and filial traditions and even customs, foods, elements of this fiction that were probably so evocative to Korean Americans who read it, but nonetheless, I still feel like this is a book that's etched in my heart. And I think that for non-Jews, I hopefully not that this is in the realm of Pachinko, but hopefully there are elements of universal love and matrilineal love and devotion and nudging that don't need the sort of direct life experience to translate. I think that in many ways this is an immigrant story. This is a story that my sister-in-law, who was my friend first before my husband and his brother met us and married us, but she's Muslim and comes from a family that couldn't be, and from South Africa, and she's not a Jewish girl from America, and this book meant a lot to her. But again, as I'm saying this, I'm like, she's my sister-in-law, so she has to say that.
I do think Pachinko is such a lovely example of that sort of ways of learning through reading. And, there's so much conversation about sort of storytelling as a mode of raising empathy and awareness and connection to others. And
yes,
I think that's an interesting question of how that kind of cultural piece plays out in both.
I hope so. I hope it does. I hope it's also the fact that like Jewish women in popular media are so often relegated to side character roles or caricature roles. And I'm happy to supply like a tough Jewish grandmother as somebody who isn't the butt of a joke, but is the one who's landing all of the jokes and who is complicated. And so like, if this is my sort of entry to like understand about Judaism 101. Like maybe it's not such a bad day, or a specific type of American Judaism. Maybe it's not such a bad way.
Well, and I found it so interesting too, the way that you talked about in the book, like the nose job thing, right? Which I know is such a funny detail, but it's such an interesting combination of the sort of very Jewish positioning and character and sense of self, but also like it almost felt falling into the stereotype of like, but don't look too Jewish. Like, right. I'll take care of that. I'll pay for that for you.
Right. It is, and there's some cases where it's sort of like a stereotype comes from somebody saying this, and my grandmother certainly said this. A stereotype would make that the only takeaway from it, but right. That is part of her.
Right, and I think that richness and willingness to show that complexity is
totally. And I say this as somebody who, like, there are times where I am just a Jewish caricature, like especially recently because Easter just happened and I'm married to a non-Jew and he's somebody who's literally never been in a church in his life, but still he's not Jewish. And my son is this blonde, blue-eyed, goy looking child. And so I have just like tripled down on how Jewish we are in our household. It is like Hanukkah is this like huge deal, and on Christmas we call it the holiday tree. Our tree topper is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Our menorah, our ornaments are dreidels from Etsy. But like Hanukkah is like the thing. So Easter happened, and my in-laws, who are lovely people, sent an Easter basket. My son was like, "This is great. Look at these brightly colored things." And so I was just like, we enjoy our springtime harvest basket. And that night I was like, oh, I made brisket. Just to like undo the like, there's like Christianity in my house. So yeah, I'm pretty bad.
So
what are you going to do?
Yeah, embrace it. A couple of other things sort of popping up over in the Q&A, and then one more place I'd love to turn our attention is the sense of, Cindy noted that her mom talked to her like your grandmother talked to you. But like you, she never doubted her love. And this sort of question of like, that feels really different in today's world of sort of super sensitive kids. Why has that changed? Or what do you see there?
Yeah, I think it's because kids started talking to each other more. it's like
when time. It doesn't stop.
Yes, exactly. It's that there's like constant input and feedback and validation. And like, I'm now going to sound like a crotchety person on a front porch, but I think that the authority figures were parents when I was growing up, and there wasn't an internet to let me know that like what I was doing was like slay, yes, queen, like wasn't be the best. And I could have used that because I really struggled with confidence growing up and still do. But I think in some way, like there was no option to talk back or to like demand respect from an elder. There just wasn't. It wasn't sort of like I'm sorry, what you're doing is toxic, and like it's just not my journey right now. That vocabulary didn't exist. It was just sort of like, I'm sorry. I think it's good and bad, but I also know that there are aspects of the way that my grandmother spoke to me that I really wouldn't ever speak to my child. I would for instance, like the playful body image stuff and like food stuff that was very much part of my experience as like a Jewish daughter. I would never, ever, ever comment about that. If I ever have a daughter, I will never say anything like that. That really does feel like something that's just like verboten. But the title "Nobody Will Tell You This But Me" is what my grandmother said to preface an insult. She's like, nobody will tell you this but me, but you'd be gorgeous if you went a little blonder. Which isn't dye your hair blonde, it's your hair is too dark.
Right. It's that very like subtle.
Totally.
Subtlety.
Nice edge of, yeah. She's not saying anything that, like, if you read a transcript, you'd be like, that's a nice thing to say. But you're like, ugh.
Tone.
Yeah. Why am I shaking?
How has the book been received by your comedy writer colleagues? How has it sort of fit into that? Has it changed what you're working on?
I mean, to my face, they've all liked it. One of them was very funny. She's like, person whose opinion I trust most. She's like, if I read books, I would love this. And it's just like, damn it. But I will say this, like one of the opinions that I trust most is Jimmy Kimmel's, and I was so nervous to have written this and for it to come out. And he is somebody who has been a guiding light in my life since I was a kid and moved to LA at 25. And when I wrote this book, I wrote it on hiatus while having a full-time job. As a Jewish woman, I'm not able to be like, I'm going to give up healthcare while I just write my book. It's like, I did this while having an extremely punishing full-time job and only wrote it on hiatuses. And so didn't have any fun for like 2 years and then got pregnant. And so I will never have fun again. When he read it, he wrote me a note that I have framed, not to be like lame about it, but I actually framed it. I sent it away, and it's because that's also a tough audience. This is somebody who reads a lot and whose comedy opinion I value above anyone else's, and has read hundreds of pages of my material over the years, and he liked this, and so that was a good opinion. My friends who are comedians, some of them blurbed the book, which is really nice, and are on the back cover. And I really appreciate the fact that this book is people who I'm a huge fan of wrote to me, which was very exciting. I think the excitement in my voice of that is like, I feel like a fraud all the time. I feel like a fraud as a comedy writer. I feel like a fraud as an author, but this feels like maybe my voice is just resonating with people, and it doesn't need to necessarily, I don't fit the mold of either. It's just what I do. And so people who said this had big laughs, who are really funny, liked it, and people who are book people liked it. And so I exist somewhere between the two, and I'm glad I've been received pretty well.
That sort of ways that none of this fits in that singular genre kind of question.
Yeah, it doesn't really. It's just my grandma being herself.
Yeah. There's also kind of a comment from Miriam. I know the book is primarily about the women in your family, but I was really struck by the prospect of a professional communist union rabble-rouser grandfather. Like, who knew that was a thing?
I totally, the men in my family are also insane and, crazy people who should not have been able to function in society. My great grandfather was a professional union organizer, which is, he was a house painter is what it said on the census. Union Square in New York City is named Union Square because people like Sam Otis, my great grandfather, would stand on soapboxes and overturn milk crates and rally for labor rights. As a union member myself, that is how I have healthcare. That is how my son has healthcare. It's how his birth costs like $150. Because I'm a union member and I have union health insurance and from the Writers Guild. And so when I got my Writers Guild card, I thought about Sam, and I thought about where I come from. And I come from a long line of people who fight for collective bargaining and labor rights. And I'm proud of that.
Yeah. What are you working on now?
I have to do the laundry. Is my reality. I mean, I'm in a pandemic with an 18-month-old. Yeah. But I have very exciting Word documents and script documents, and hopefully they will be things. But I'm not trying to be purposely vague. I just don't ever put the cart before the horse until I see something signed. But I'm working on a TV show. I'm working on a next book. I wrote a children's book and about toxic masculinity.
Excellent.
And being short, and because when I had a son, people started giving me the feminist book said, and like Ada, whatever, scientist. And it's like, okay, first of all, it shouldn't be extraordinary that a woman is a scientist. Like maybe, like it's, and also like, I'm not going to make him like unable to relate. Yes, he loves this tiny book about Eleanor Roosevelt, but he also loves a book about a red circle with a smile on it. So like maybe we can address, but whatever. I have a whole soapbox about like how to make a generation of young men be good allies. Anyway, that's my real project. My real project is having a sleeper cell rise up and be a feminist.
It feels like an incredibly important project right now.
It is. That's my project. My son is my my best possible thing that I'm working on.
Yeah. And would you just sort of as a kind of last question, talk to us a little bit about the TV adaptation and or film adaptation?
Oh, the movie. And I'm also writing the screenplay. I'm writing the script. So what are the genres of entertainment? I'm doing all of them. I'm doing book, TV show, movie, and children's book, and a streaming special.
Just a couple things. How is the movie coming? How has that felt to try to translate the words from the page back into sort of the air, the stage, the voice in a different way?
Totally. It's the hardest project I've ever done because I take this so seriously. It is I'm in such good hands with this project. The production company Sight Unseen Pictures has made a lot of really beautiful movies. The most recent one was the one with Hugh Jackman and Allison Janney about the scandal at the Roslyn School District called Bad Education. Mm-hmm. And it was a true story about a complicated protagonist, anti-hero, done really well. And so I feel like I have people who really know what they're doing in the driver's seat. And I am just the one who's like, here's the dialogue. Thank you. This is how they speak. I'm sort of like, I'm the scribe for all of these projects. I'm just writing. I'm doing what I did here, which is I'm just writing the words, and other people make them reality. And so I'm so lucky that I have a truly brilliant director, Elizabeth Chomko, who made a movie about her own mother's struggle with Alzheimer's. It's called What They Had. It starred Blythe Danner and Michael Shannon, Hilary Swank. It was one of these small independent movies with like 99% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's so tenderly and beautifully and smartly done. And so I feel like I have people who really know the art of filmmaking behind it and how to make a movie about a real person and about an older woman, and make that a something compelling and not a spectacle, but something really tender and loving. And so I'm in good hands. So fortunately, I'm not in control of any of it. So
one last question. I find myself wondering, sort of as we conclude, if you could leave your grandmother sort of one voicemail, what would you want recorded for her, kind of a year into this book in the world?
It would be what's in my dedication. It would be, thank you, Grandma. Okay. It would be really, really short. That's what it would say. And I'd like to think if she's receiving it, she would know exactly what for.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it back to Alex or Marcy to wrap up for the evening.
Thank you, Freya. This was such a lovely talk. It was such a pleasure speaking with you about this. Thank you.
Sure.
Let's see. Hi, everybody. There we go. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Bess. Thank you so much to Freya. Thank you so much to Alex, the JCCs of New Orleans, of Memphis and Nashville. I'm Marcy Stagner. I'm the Arts and Culture Director in Memphis at the JCC here. I'm here right now. And thank you to the Jewish Historical Society of Memphis and the Mid-South. And thank you to all of you for coming. We've really enjoyed it. This has been wonderful and lovely. And thank you so much. I love the book. My book club loved it. If you have not gotten a chance to read it yet, I highly recommend you go out and get it at your local bookseller. If you're in Memphis, you can get it at Novel, or your local bookseller in Nashville or New Orleans. And of course, it's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, places like that too. But we always like to support locals, so help us do that, especially right now. Anyway, thank you all so much again for coming, and we'll see you soon.